The wind carried whispers that day. It rolled through the streets of Dry Creek like a restless spirit, lifting skirts, rattling the saloon's faded shutters, and stirring up more than just dust. Out on the edge of town, where the prairie bled into endless horizon, a man in a weather-worn duster leaned against a hitching post, his hat tipped low, boots buried ankle-deep in the red earth. Jackson Kane had the look of a man carved from the land itself, lean, quiet, sun-baked and dangerous in the way a rattler is dangerous before it strikes. He wasn't here for trouble. At least that's what he told himself when he rode in 2 days ago with his 10 herds grazing miles out along Broken Arrow Creek. But trouble had a way of finding men like Jackson. Men who'd lived hard, lost harder, and carried scars deep beneath their skin where no one could see. And then he saw her. Evelyn Hart stood outside the general store, the hem of her simple mourning dress brushing against her boots, one hand clutching a wicker basket like it was the only solid thing holding her upright. There was something untouchable about her, like sunlight falling through stained glass, the kind of woman who kept her chin high even when the world had taken everything from her. And it had. Everyone in Dry Creek knew the story. The widow Hart, left alone at 26 when her husband died in a hunting accident last winter, managing a crumbling homestead on her own. Jackson watched her that day the way a starving man watches the sky for rain. The hook, the offer he didn't mean to say it aloud, not there in the quiet shadows of the mercantile's porch where only she could hear. But when she brushed past him, soft lavender soap clinging faintly to her skin, the words tore out like a bullet fired from the gut. "I'd trade 10 herds for one night inside you," he whispered. Evelyn stopped cold, the color draining from her cheeks, her basket hanging useless at her side. Her eyes, storm gray and wary, snapped to his, searching for cruelty, for mockery, for anything that might soften the weight of what he'd just confessed. But there was no laughter in Jackson Kane's face, no jest in the gravel of his voice. You'd best take that back," she managed, breath trembling. "I can't," he said simply. "Ain't a man alive could." And just like that, the ground shifted beneath them both. The weight of Whispersby sundown, Dry Creek was buzzing like a rattlesnake's tail. The saloon doors flapped, the piano player faltered mid-tune, and everywhere Evelyn walked, eyes followed. The widow Hart, caught in scandal, the drifter with the 10 herds, making an indecent offer bold enough to set the prairie on fire. Inside the Silver Spur saloon, men leaned close over whiskey-stained tables, voices low and sharp. Heard he offered her cattle, someone muttered. "More'n just cattle," another said. "Man's half mad." "Or half in love," a third guessed, drawing laughter that held no mirth. Out on the prairie, 10 herds grazed under the wide, bleeding sunset, the promise of wealth, security, survival, and every whisper wound tighter around Evelyn's throat, squeezing until the weight of it all became unbearable, Evelyn's grief. That night, she sat by the single oil lamp in her kitchen, the old clapboard house creaking beneath the restless wind. Her husband's boots still rested by the door, gathering dust she couldn't bring herself to sweep away. Grief was supposed to fade, wasn't it? Months had passed, yet some nights she still woke reaching for a body that would never warm. Her again, and now this stranger, this wild-eyed cowboy with a voice like summer thunder, had thrown her life into chaos with one reckless sentence. She wanted to hate him. She tried. But when she closed her eyes, she saw him standing there on that porch, hat tipped low, jaw tight, desire blazing clear as firelight. No shame, no hesitation, and buried beneath her outrage, beneath her fear, there was something else she dared not name. Jackson's past, Jackson Kane, was no stranger to want. Want had driven him most of his life, for land, for freedom, for something better than the hollow trail of regret he'd left behind. He'd ridden with outlaws once, bad men with darker souls. He'd spilled blood in towns smaller than Dry Creek and done things he never spoke of, but he'd clawed his way back from the edge, bought his herds fair and square, and swore he'd never again be ruled by hunger of any kind. Until Evelyn Hart looked at him on that dusty street, and he felt something shift deep in his bones. He didn't want her body, and not just her body. He wanted her fire, her quiet strength, her unbroken spirit. He wanted the way she stood her ground even when life had knocked her flat. And for the first time in years, Jackson Kane was willing to risk everything for something he couldn't own, couldn't tame, couldn't buy, not even with 10 herds. Storm. Clouds gathering, but men like Jackson didn't get what they wanted without a fight. What neither he nor Evelyn knew was that others had plans for her land. Powerful men with deep pockets and hired guns. And the moment Jackson's bold offer became town gossip, it stirred more than scandal. It stirred greed. By week's end, strangers would start riding into Dry Creek, ranch hands who weren't there for work, bounty hunters sniffing around for Jackson's past, and a cattle baron with eyes colder than a snake's, determined to claim Evelyn's homestead by any means necessary. And through it all, the widow and the cowboy would be drawn closer, their fates tangled like barbed wire under an endless western sky. By the time the sun rose over Dry Creek the next morning, the words Jackson Kane had spoken to Evelyn Hart were halfway to becoming legend. In a town this small, scandal moved faster than wildfire through dry grass, feeding on hunger, loneliness, and dreams. Folks were too proud to admit they had. Evelyn kept her head down as she crossed the dusty street toward the post office, clutching a folded letter from her sister in her hands. She didn't need to look to know the townsfolk were watching her. She could feel their stares prickling against her skin, hear the low murmur of voices behind her back, taste the unspoken judgment heavy as the grit in the air. Inside, her heart drummed so loud it drowned out the world. She'd survived worse than gossip, harder winters, lonelier nights, the cold weight of a man's boots no longer beside hers. But somehow, this felt different, more dangerous. The price of a name they called her Widow Hart now, as though her name had shrunk, her life stripped down to that single defining wound. Once she'd been Evelyn, daughter, sister, dreamer. Once she'd thought she'd found safety on the Hart Ranch, marrying a man who promised her gentle mornings and steady nights. But promises were easy in the Old West. It was keeping them that proved near impossible. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man in the beginning. At least that's what she told herself during the lonely months after his death, when the memory of his early kindness was all she had left to cling to. But as the years wore on, the truth had seeped into the cracks of her grief. Thomas Hart had secrets, debts, dangerous ones. She knew only fragments. A missing ledger, locked drawers she'd been forbidden to open, sudden trips into town followed by long stretches of silence. And now those shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if death hadn't erased Thomas's mistakes, but left Evelyn standing in their wake. Jackson's restless night across Broken Arrow Creek. Jackson Kane barely slept. He'd bedded down under an old cottonwood with his hat pulled low and his Colt close to hand, but the night carried too much weight for rest to come easy. He replayed her expression over and over, that mix of shock, anger, and something softer. She hadn't meant for him to see. He hadn't planned on wanting her. He hadn't planned on staying this long either. Dry Creek was supposed to be a pit stop, a place to water the herds and move on before trouble sniffed out his trail. Because trouble always did. Jackson's past wasn't the kind a man outran forever. He still bore the mark of the Sierra Mesa gang, an old scar above his ribs, a bounty that had quieted but never disappeared. Years ago, he'd left outlaw life behind, traded bullets for branding irons, thinking he could build something honest from the ruins. But honesty didn't change the kind of man the world believed him to be. And maybe they weren't wrong. Knock at midnight. It was well past midnight when Evelyn heard it. 3 sharp raps against her front door. She froze at the kitchen table, fingers tightening around the chipped porcelain cup of cold tea. Outside, the wind had died, leaving the prairie breathless and still. She lit the oil lamp and opened the door a crack. On the porch stood a man she'd never seen before, his hat pulled low, the faint glint of a revolver at his hip. "Mrs. Hart," he said, voice smooth as river stones. "Forgive the hour. Name's Silas Crawford. I represent Mr. Everett Blake." Evelyn frowned. She'd heard the name before. Everyone had. Everett Blake owned more land than God himself, a cattle baron whose influence stretched across 3 territories. "What business could a man like Mr. Blake have with me?" Silas smiled, slow and cold. Your land, he said simply. And the debts left behind by your late husband. Mr. Blake's prepared to offer you a fair settlement, if you're willing to sell. Her breath caught, fury sparking hot beneath her grief. My husband's debts aren't my burden, she said, and this land isn't for sale. Silas tipped his hat, but his smile never reached his eyes. That's mighty unfortunate, ma'am, he said softly. Sometimes circumstances decide for us. And just like that, he disappeared into the night, leaving Evelyn standing in the doorway, heart pounding against the weight of new danger. Trouble rides in by dawn. The town wasn't just whispering about scandal, it was bracing for something worse. 2 riders from Blake's outfit had arrived overnight, their silhouettes dark against the pale horizon. They stabled their horses at the Silver Spur and spent the morning surveying the town like predators sizing up prey. Jackson spotted them first. He was leaning against the fence at the edge of the Hart property when he caught sight of their dust trails. 2 dark riders cutting through the prairie like blades. He knew Blake's kind. He'd ridden with men like him once, rich cattle kings with hands bloodied by the work of others. He also knew that when Blake sent riders, it wasn't for polite negotiations. Jackson untied his mare and rode hard toward town. An unlikely protector found Evelyn outside the blacksmith's, her arms laden with supplies, her chin lifted stubbornly against the curious stares of onlookers. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said quietly, falling into step beside her. And you shouldn't be anywhere near me, she shot back, voice sharp enough to draw blood. He didn't argue. He just matched her pace, his gaze scanning the rooftops, the alleys, the faces too interested in her business. Blake's men are here, he said finally. You need to be careful. She stopped short, the color draining from her face. He sent someone to my door last night, she whispered. He knows about Thomas's debts. Jackson's jaw tightened. Then he knows you're vulnerable, he said. And men like Blake, they don't ask twice. For the first time since they'd met, Evelyn didn't tell him to leave her be. She just stood there in the dusty street, staring up at him like she was searching for an anchor in the middle of a rising storm, shadows on the horizon. That evening, Evelyn returned to the ranch to find an unfamiliar horse tied to her fence post. Inside, a man waited in her kitchen, hat tossed carelessly on the table, boots muddy with creek silt. He smiled when she entered, but there was nothing warm in it. Mrs. Hart, he drawled. Name's Sawyer. I work for Mr. Blake. We've come to collect what's owed. Behind him, 2 more men stepped in from the shadows, their hands resting on their belts, knuckles brushing steel. Before Evelyn could speak, the door slammed open and Jackson Kane filled the frame, revolver drawn, eyes cold as a winter dawn. You boys are lost, he said flatly. Get off this land. Sawyer's grin widened. Or what? Jackson didn't answer. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence, the steady aim of his Colt, and the scars on his knuckles told the story for him. The men hesitated, tension thick as summer heat. Finally, Sawyer tipped his hat and stepped back. Reckon we'll be seeing you again, he said. Soon. And then they were gone, leaving Evelyn and Jackson standing in the fading light. Both knowing this was only the beginning, by mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron, heavy, clouds rolling low across the horizon like an advancing army. The air smelled of snow, sharp, biting, and cold enough to claw at the lungs with every breath. In the distance, the prairie grass bent beneath the rising gusts, whispering of trouble even before the first flake fell. Jackson Kane sat his horse at the ridge overlooking Broken Arrow Creek, scanning the horizon where storm met land. The herds grazed restless beneath him, heads tossing, hooves shifting in the churned mud. Cattle always knew before a storm hit. Their unease mirrored his own. He didn't like leaving them, but he had a bad feeling gnawing at him since the night Sawyer and Blake's men came sniffing around Evelyn Hart's ranch. Ever since then, he'd kept watch from a distance, making sure no uninvited visitors came back. But today, as he turned his mare toward her homestead, he saw the sky breaking wide open, and he knew before sundown everything in Dry Creek was going to change. The widow's defiance. Evelyn Hart had been stacking wood by the side of the house when she saw Jackson riding hard across the prairie. The wind stung her cheeks, pulling loose strands of hair from beneath her bonnet, and instinct made her glance over her shoulder, half expecting Blake's men to come riding up behind him. They hadn't returned since that tense night in her kitchen, but their absence only made her more uneasy. Silence, she'd learned, was often more dangerous than noise. Jackson dismounted in one swift motion, boots sinking into frozen earth as he strode up the porch steps. "Storm's coming," he said without greeting, his voice sharp, clipped, urgent. "You've got maybe an hour before it hits hard." Evelyn nodded, arms wrapped tight around herself. "I can manage," she said, her chin lifting with stubborn pride. "I've weathered storms before." He looked past her, toward the thin wooden walls of the house, the loose shutters, the small pile of firewood stacked against the wall. "Not like this one," he muttered. "This ain't just wind and snow. This one'll kill a man standing if he ain't careful." She bristled at the edge in his tone, but there was something else beneath it too. Something quieter. Concern. Shadows behind the storm as they worked together to secure the shutters and haul the last of the wood inside. Evelyn noticed something different in Jackson. He wasn't restless the way he usually was, pacing like a man ready to move on. Today, there was a heaviness to him, like the storm wasn't just in the sky but brewing inside his chest. When she asked, he avoided her gaze, jaw tight. "Saw fresh tracks out by the creek," he said finally, stacking the last of the logs by the hearth. "3 riders, maybe 4. Weren't mine, weren't yours." Her breath caught. "Blake?" He shrugged. "Could be. Could also be bounty men following my trail." Evelyn turned sharply, frowning. "Bounty men?" Jackson cursed under his breath, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "I told you before. I've done things I ain't proud of. Rode with men I shouldn't have. I broke from 'em years back, but blood don't wash clean, not out here. Some folks'd pay good coin to see me swinging from a rope." She stared at him, searching his face, trying to reconcile the man standing before her with the shadowed pieces of his past. "Why tell me this now?" she asked softly. He met her gaze, his expression bare, unguarded. "'Cause if trouble comes knocking, it might be looking for me as much as it's looking for you. Figure you deserve to know the truth." The admission hung between them, heavy and unspoken, like the storm pressing down from the sky. Trapped. By the blizzard be nightfall, the blizzard roared across Dry Creek, swallowing the prairie whole. Snow lashed the house in wild sheets, the wind howling like a living thing. Inside, the old clapboard farmhouse groaned beneath the weight of it. Icy drafts slipped through every crack, sending shadows dancing in the flicker of the oil lamp. Evelyn and Jackson sat near the hearth, the fire their only defense against the creeping cold. Outside, the world had vanished. No horizon, no herds, no town. Just endless white, thick as smoke, blurring the line between earth and sky. Evelyn tried to keep busy, mending an old tear in her shawl, rearranging the tins on the pantry shelf. But her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Jackson sat across from her, hat pulled low, long legs stretched toward the fire. He hadn't said much since night fell, but his presence filled the small room like another heartbeat. Every creak of the house, every wail of wind, every shifting shadow made her more aware of just how alone they were out here. Alone. And together. Embers and confessions. At some point she gave up pretending to work and sat by the window, staring into the white void where the storm swallowed the world whole. "I hate winters," she whispered almost to herself. "Always have." Jackson glanced up, waiting. "Reminds me how empty it can get out here," she continued, voice softer now. "How easy it is to disappear and be forgotten." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, eyes fixed on her in the firelight. "You ain't forgotten," he said, his voice low, rough as gravel. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "In this town I'm already gone. I'm just the widow now. No one remembers who I was before." Jackson stood, slow and deliberate, crossing the room until he was close enough she could feel the heat radiating off him despite the cold. "I remember," he said. Her breath caught, 1,000 words tangled behind her lips, but none of them found their way out. Trouble in the snow. The moment hung between them, fragile and unspoken, until a sound shattered it. Faint but distinct, beneath the howl of the storm. Hoofbeats. Jackson stiffened, his hand going instinctively to the Colt at his side. Evelyn's eyes went wide, her breath fogging the glass as she peered into the swirling dark. Through the blur of snow, shadowed figures emerged, 4 of them on horseback, moving slow but steady toward the house. Jackson swore under his breath. "Blake's men," he said. Or worse. He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness save for the faint glow of the fire. "Get upstairs," he ordered softly. "Jackson, go, Evelyn, now." She hesitated, heart pounding, but the steel in his voice left no room for argument. She disappeared up the narrow stairs, each creak of the wood sounding louder than the storm itself. Jackson stayed by the window, revolver drawn, breath slow, steady, patient. The storm had trapped them, but it had trapped their enemies too. The blizzard had buried the prairie in white, but it hadn't hidden the tracks outside Evelyn Hart's farmhouse. 4 horses, 4 riders. They'd circled the property sometime in the night, staying just far enough out of range, their silhouettes swallowed by the storm. Jackson Kane crouched by the window, revolver loose in his hand, eyes sharp as a hawk's. His breath clouded faintly in the cold as he tracked the pattern of prints cutting across the drifts. "They're playing patient," he muttered. "Watchin'. Waitin'." Behind him, Evelyn hugged her shawl tighter. Around her shoulders, the thin wool no match for the chill seeping through the house. "How long do you think they'll wait?" she asked softly. Jackson glanced over his shoulder, his expression grim. "Long as they need to. Storm's past now. They'll want answers before nightfall." Her throat tightened. "Answers about what?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told her more than any words could. "About me," he admitted finally. "And about Thomas." The sins of the dead Evelyn stiffened. "Thomas?" Jackson nodded slowly, standing and crossing to the small table where Evelyn kept her late husband's old ledger book stacked neatly beneath a worn lamp. He set his revolver down and picked up the topmost ledger, flipping through its yellowed pages, finger-tracing names she didn't recognize. "These debts," he said quietly. "They ain't just numbers. Blake's name ain't written anywhere in here, but I'd bet my last dollar Thomas was dealing with him. That means Blake figures he owns this land, and you if he gets his way." Evelyn's stomach dropped, the room tilting beneath her as the pieces began to fall into place. Thomas's secret trips into town, the locked drawers she'd never dared open, the arguments late at night she could barely remember now. "He promised me," she whispered almost to herself. "He promised we were free of all that." Jackson's gaze softened, his voice low, steady. Maybe he believed it when he said it. Maybe he didn't. Don't change the truth of it now. "Blake's coming to collect, Evelyn." She looked up at him, the firelight catching the storm gray of her eyes. "And you? Why are you still here? This isn't your fight." Jackson paused, jaw tightening. "Ain't about what's mine to fight. It's about what's right." Ghosts of Jackson's past, but Evelyn wasn't blind. She could see it in the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested instinctively near his revolver, the way his gaze kept darting to the horizon like a hunted man. "There's more. You're not telling me," she said quietly. He sighed, dragging a hand down his face, the weight of old sins settling like dust in his voice. "There's a bounty on me," he admitted finally. "Still is. I rode with the Sierra Mesa gang 6 years back. Did things I can't take back. Walked away when I figured out what kind of man their leader was. Me. But you don't just walk clean out of hell. Some of Blake's men, they used to ride with us." Evelyn drew in a sharp breath. "So if they find you here, they won't. Stop at collecting debts," he finished. "They'll burn this place down to smoke and ash just to get to me." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, but she didn't flinch, didn't step back. "Then we make a stand," she said simply. For a moment, something flickered in Jackson's eyes. Something raw and unspoken. Part admiration, part fear. Arrival of the Lakota healer bee midday, the sound of distant hooves carried across the frozen prairie. But this time it wasn't Blake's men. A rider approached on a painted horse wrapped in a deerskin cloak, long black braid trailing behind him. Jackson recognized him instantly. Nahu, a young Lakota healer he'd met years ago when the Sierra Mesa gang's violence spilled into tribal lands. Jackson stepped outside, hand raised in greeting. "You came a long way," he said. Nahu dismounted, smoothly, eyes scanning the tracks around the homestead before settling on Jackson. "Word travels faster than snow," he said simply. "Blake's men passed through our hunting grounds. 4 riders, 2 bounty hunters, 1 tracker." Jackson cursed under his breath. "They mean to box us in," Nahu added. Inside, Evelyn watched through the frosted glass, her heart hammering as fragments of Lakota drifted faintly through the wind. When Jackson led Nahu inside and introduced him, she nodded politely, though her confusion was plain. "Why would he help us?" she whispered later when Nahu stepped outside to tend his horse. Jackson's voice was low, rough with regret. "Because years ago I owed him a debt I can't repay. Saved my life once when I didn't deserve saving. Now he's returned the favor." Blood on the snow. They didn't have long to prepare. By late afternoon, the first gunshot cracked the stillness, splintering the porch rail where Jackson had been standing moments before. Evelyn screamed, diving for cover as he yanked her down behind the heavy oak table. "Stay low," he hissed, drawing his Colt. Through the window he spotted the riders, 4 silhouettes fanning out across the snow, rifles glinting in the fading light. Nahu slipped inside, crouching low, bow already strung. "2 circling the barn," he murmured, 2 coming straight for the door. Jackson's pulse roared in his ears. The next shot shattered the window, spraying glass across the floor. Evelyn stifled a sob, clutching the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jackson squeezed her hand once, quick, firm, grounding, before crawling to the far wall where he could sight down his revolver. "On my mark," he muttered to Nahu. The barn door creaked. Boots crunched in the snow. "Now." The crack of gunfire split the air, deafening in the enclosed space. 2 riders went down before the others returned fire. Bullets slamming into the walls, splinters flying like shrapnel. Evelyn pressed both hands over her ears, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening. Aftermath. When the gunfire finally stilled, the prairie lay silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Jackson stepped outside into the deepening dusk, boots crunching over blood-spattered snow. 2 bodies lay sprawled near the barn, their rifles abandoned in the drift. The other 2 had fled, but not before leaving a trail easy enough to follow. He stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, shoulders taut, the smoke from his revolver curling into the frozen air. Inside, Evelyn sat by the hearth, her hands trembling violently despite the fire's heat. Nahu moved quietly, tending to a shallow graze along her temple where glass had cut her. Jackson returned, crouching before her, his voice rough but gentle. "You all right?" She nodded shakily. "This isn't over, is it?" she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "No, this was just a warning." Even the wind seemed to hold its breath beneath the bruised expanse of twilight, as if the land itself sensed the violence waiting to break loose. Evelyn Hart stood on the porch of her farmhouse, fingers curled around the rail so tightly her knuckles ached, staring out across the white-dusted fields toward Broken Arrow Creek. Jackson Kane hadn't come back yet. It had been 2 days since the firefight near the barn. 2 days since Blake's men rode off and left 2 bodies behind in the snow, and 2 days since Jackson saddled his horse and vanished into the blizzard without a word, leaving only a trail of hoofprints swallowed by drifting white. She told herself she didn't care, told herself she didn't need him. But when she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow of his hand tightening around hers before the bullets started flying, heard the rasp of his voice in the dark when he whispered, "Stay low," and now, With the silence pressing down on her like a storm yet to break, she realized the terrible truth. She'd grown used to feeling safer when he was near. An unwelcome guest? The crunch of hooves on frozen earth snapped her out of her thoughts. Evelyn's heart lurched as she turned toward the road, praying it was Jackson. But it wasn't. Everett Blake rode at the head of 3 men, their silhouettes sharp against the dying sun, their horses kicking up long shadows on the frost-bitten ground. Blake was everything the whispers claimed. Tall, broad, and dressed in a fine black coat better suited to a saloon in New York than a ranch in Dry Creek. His hat sat low over calculating eyes, his jaw clean-shaven, his boots polished to a shine. He dismounted with deliberate slowness as though the entire prairie bent to his will. "Mrs. Hart," he said, voice smooth and cold as river ice. "We need to talk." Evelyn swallowed hard, holding the doorframe like an anchor. "I have nothing to say to you." His smile was polite, practiced, deadly. "Then you'd best listen." He gestured for his men to wait by the horses and stepped closer, boots crunching softly on the snow. "Your husband owed me," he said. "More than you can pay, and more than your land is worth. But I'm a reasonable man, Evelyn. I make fair trades." Her throat tightened, bile rising. "I'm not selling this land." "You misunderstand me," he said smoothly. "I'm not here to buy it. I'm here to take it. The only question is whether you want to make that easy or hard." Evelyn's nails dug into the wood behind her. "And if I refuse?" Blake's smile sharpened like a blade. "Then I'll burn it to the ground and salt the earth so nothing grows here again." The offer, he let the threat hang for a long moment before softening his tone, tilting his head in feigned sympathy. "There's another way," he said gently. "Marry me." Evelyn's breath caught, her body going rigid. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, his voice smooth as silk. "You'll keep the house, the land, security for the rest of your life. No more debts, no more fear. I'll give you everything Thomas couldn't." She stared at him, disbelief hardening into fury. "I'd rather die." His smile didn't falter. "You say that now," he murmured, leaning close enough for her to smell the faint tobacco on his breath. "But think on it, Evelyn. Think on the blizzard nights and the empty cupboards. Think on how lonely this land gets, and think on Cain." Her eyes narrowed. "Leave him out of this." "Oh, I can't," Blake said softly. "See, men like him, they don't get happy endings. He's got a bounty on his head and blood on his hands. Sooner or later, someone's going to cash in. Question is, do you want to be standing next to him when it happens?" Before she could answer, he tipped his hat and mounted his horse again, riding off without another word, leaving his threat coiled like a rattlesnake at her feet. Jackson. Return's night had fallen by the time Jackson rode back into the yard, snow crusted along the brim of his hat, the mare's flanks steaming from the cold. Evelyn stormed out onto the porch, her shawl whipping in the wind. "Where the hell have you been?" she demanded, voice sharp enough to cut. Jackson dismounted slowly, tying off the reins before meeting her furious gaze. "Scouting," he said. "Blake's gathering twice as many men as before, maybe more. They'll be back inside a week." "He was here today," she shot back, breath trembling. Jackson's expression darkened instantly. "What did he say?" She hesitated, then forced the words out through clenched teeth. "He offered me a choice, and marry him or lose everything." Jackson's jaw tightened, his hand flexing near the Colt on his hip. "And what did you say?" She stared at him, eyes blazing. "I told him I'd rather die," she whispered fiercely. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind tearing through the frozen grass. Finally, Jackson stepped closer, his voice rough, low, dangerous. "Then we fight." The confession, that night the two of them sat by the fire, the weight of the day pressing down like a millstone. Nahu had gone back to his people to warn them of Blake's expanding reach, leaving them alone in the small farmhouse. Evelyn stared into the flames, her hands clasped in her lap, words gathering in her throat like storm clouds. "Jackson," she said quietly. He turned to her, his face carved in shadow and firelight. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of dying, not even of Blake. I'm scared of what he makes me want to do. I'm scared of what you make me want to do. The silence stretched, brittle and charged. Jackson shifted closer, the firelight catching the edges of his worn duster, his jaw tightening as though holding back words he wasn't sure he had a right to speak. Say it plain, Evelyn, he said softly. Her breath shook. I don't want to want you, she whispered. But I do. His eyes burned into hers, his voice a rough scrape of need and restraint. Ain't nothing in this world I want. More than you, he said, but wanting you puts a target on your back. Blake knows it. Hell, half the town knows it. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Then let him come, she said. I'd rather take my chances beside you than spend a lifetime safe in Blake's shadow. The dawn came cold and gray, stretching pale light over the endless sweep of Broken Arrow Creek Valley. Frost clung to the bare branches, the air sharp enough to cut. From the porch of her farmhouse, Evelyn Hart stared at the horizon, where a dark smudge of riders bled against the pale sky. They were coming. She'd known it would be today. Nahu had returned the night before with word from his scouts. Everett Blake had gathered more than 24 men, hired guns, bounty hunters, and former outlaws, all headed straight for her land. Blake wasn't interested in threats anymore. He'd come to take what he believed was his. Behind her, the house smelled faintly of smoke and gun oil. Jackson Kane stood by the table, checking the revolvers one last time, laying out boxes of cartridges in neat rows like prayer beads. His shoulders were rigid beneath his worn duster, his jaw tight with quiet resolve. Evelyn turned to him, forcing her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. You should go, she whispered. Jackson didn't even look up. Ain't happening. This isn't your fight, Jackson. He slid a fresh round into the cylinder, snapping it closed with a practiced flick, then finally lifted his gaze to hers. You said you'd rather die than marry Blake, he said softly. Well, darlin', that means it is my fight. Her breath caught, the weight of his words settling in her chest like a brand. 40 hooves on frozen ground. By mid-morning, the rumble of approaching riders rolled across the prairie like distant thunder. Evelyn stood at the window, fingers digging into the sill, watching as Blake's men fanned out across the lower fields, cutting off every escape. Jackson stepped up beside her, his hand brushing hers where it rested against the glass. We hold. I'm here, he said, his voice low, steady, unshaken. House gives us cover. Nahu's set snares in the creek bed and your back fence lines rigged with charges. Blake won't know what hit him. Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing down the rising panic. And if we don't hold? He glanced at her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Then we make 'em bleed for every inch they take. Everett Blake arrives. The riders slowed as they approached, forming a tight semicircle around the front of the farmhouse. Everett Blake rode at the head, dressed in his immaculate black coat, a long-barreled Colt resting casually across his thigh. He sat his horse like a man who'd never heard the word no in his life. Kane, Blake called, his voice carrying clear across the frost-bitten yard. Come on out, let's talk like men before this gets ugly. Jackson stepped onto the porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, boots crunching against frozen boards. Evelyn's breath hitched as she followed close behind, though he held out a hand behind his back, a quiet command for her to stay put. You got 30 seconds to turn around, Jackson said evenly. After that, you step 1 foot closer and we settle this right here. Blake smiled, slow and confident. Settle it, he said. Oh, Kane, I'm not here to settle. I'm here to collect. Betrayal revealed, Jackson opened his mouth to reply, and then froze as the barn door creaked open behind them. Out stepped Silas Crawford, Blake's right hand, holding a rifle loosely at his side. Evelyn tensed instinctively, but what made Jackson's blood run cold wasn't the rifle. It was the ledger Silas carried beneath his arm. Thomas Hart's missing ledger. Silas tossed it into the snow at Evelyn's feet, his voice slick with satisfaction. Your husband made a deal, Mrs. Hart. Signed it in his own hand. You think this land's yours? It's been Blake's since the day Thomas put ink to paper. Evelyn stared at the worn leather cover, her pulse roaring in her ears. That's a lie, she whispered, though even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her like a starving thing. Jackson crouched, picking up the ledger and flipping it open, scanning the pages until he found Thomas's signature scrawled across the bottom of a contract stained with whiskey and desperation. "Hell," he muttered, his chest tightening. Evelyn's voice broke, raw and shaking. "He promised me." Jackson closed the ledger and set it gently on the porch railing. "Don't you carry his sins," he said softly. "He ain't here to pay for 'em. We are. The gunfight at Broken." Arrow Creek Blake's patience ran out fast. "Enough talk," he barked. "Take the house." And then chaos erupted. Rifle fire cracked across the yard, splintering the porch rail as bullets tore into the siding. Jackson shoved Evelyn back inside, slamming the door shut just as Nahu loosed an arrow from the loft, dropping the first rider clean from his saddle. Inside, the farmhouse roared with sound. The sharp thunder of Jackson's Colt, the shriek of glass shattering, Evelyn's ragged breathing as she ducked behind the overturned table. Outside, Blake's men advanced in waves, trampling snow darkened by blood. But every step forward cost them. Nahu's traps along the creek detonated beneath, 2 riders throwing mud and smoke high into the air. Jackson's rifle cracked again and again, each shot measured, precise, merciless. Still, they kept coming. A bullet grazed Jackson's shoulder, sending him sprawling against the doorframe, blood seeping warm through his duster. Evelyn screamed his name, but he waved her back, teeth gritted against the pain. "Stay down," he barked, reloading with practiced speed. She ignored him, crawling to the window and grabbing the spare rifle. Hands shaking, she aimed for the rider charging the porch and pulled the trigger. The man fell hard into the snow. Evelyn's breath hitched, her whole body trembling as she lowered the rifle. Jackson glanced at her, something fierce and unspoken. Passing between them, face to face, as the smoke thinned, only a handful of riders remained. Everett Blake stood among them, coat unruffled, hat pristine, eyes cold and burning. He stepped forward slowly, revolver drawn, voice carrying above the wind. "This ends now, Kane." Jackson limped off the porch, reloading his Colt with steady hands despite the blood soaking his sleeve. "You're right," he said, his voice low, rough. "It does." The 2 men faced each other across the trampled snow, breaths ghosting in the cold. Neither spoke, neither moved. Then the world erupted in a single deafening gunshot. For a heartbeat, Evelyn couldn't tell who'd fired, who'd fallen, and then Blake staggered, his pristine coat blooming crimson at the shoulder before collapsing into the churned snow. His men faltered. Without their leader, they broke and scattered, vanishing into the trees like smoke. The caused silence returned to Broken Arrow Creek, heavy and absolute. Jackson dropped to one knee, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder, his breath coming ragged. Evelyn ran to him, catching his weight against her as the cold bit deep into their lungs. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Been worse," he muttered, forcing a crooked smile. Behind them, Nahu emerged from the barn loft, bow still in hand, scanning the horizon. "They won't be back soon," he said quietly. "But they will come again. Men like Blake always have brothers, cousins, partners with long memories." Jackson nodded grimly. "Then we'll be ready. Redemption under the western sky that night." The farmhouse stood silent under the wide western sky, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Evelyn sat beside Jackson's bed, tending his wound with careful hands, the firelight painting soft shadows across his scarred face. He watched her in silence, eyes heavy but unyielding, until finally he spoke. "I ain't got 10 herds anymore," he said softly. "Spent 'em all fighting for this place." Evelyn smiled faintly, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "I never wanted your herds, Jackson." His hand found hers, rough and warm and steady despite the tremor of exhaustion. "Then what do you want?" he asked, his voice barely more than a rasp. She leaned closer, her gaze unwavering. "Just you," she whispered. Outside, the prairie stretched endless beneath the stars, silent and waiting. The fight for Broken Arrow Creek was over. For now. But somewhere beyond the horizon, another storm was already brewing. End of Book 1.